Upon its release in 1847, Jane Eyre was instantly recognised as a masterpiece of English literature. The novel is both a critique and a celebration of Victorian society, and remains as engaging and entertaining as ever.
Jane, I never meant to wound you thus. If the man who had but one little ewe lamb that was as dear to him as a daughter, that ate of his bread, drank of his cup, lay in his bosom, had, by some mistake, slaughtered it of the shambles, he could not rue his bloody blunder more than I now rue mine. Will you ever forgive me?
Reader, I forgave him at the moment and on the spot. There was such deep remorse in his eye, such true pity in his tone, and such manly energy in his manner. And besides, there was such unchanged love in his whole look and mien. I forgave him all. Yet not in words, not outwardly, only at my heart's core.
Oh, Jane Eyre is a marvellous novel. It's one of those most powerful and influential novels in the whole of English literature. It leaves a lasting impact, I think, on anybody who has read it. And it had a tremendous effect on the world, the literary world that came after it.
Its author, Charlotte Bronte, was born on the 21st of April 1816 to the Reverend Patrick Bronte and his wife Maria. She was their third daughter, and the next 4 years would see the birth of two more daughters, Emily, Jane and Anne, as well as a son, Branwell. When Charlotte was 4 years old, the family moved from Shropshire to Haworth, a small mill town in West Yorkshire, where the Reverend Bronte held a permanent position in the local parish.
We have to remember that Charlotte Bronte herself was only 5 when her mother died. She herself said later that she had no memory of her mother. Instead, Charlotte grew up in a household of sisters and one brother. It was her siblings who were terribly important to her. And the household was ruled, and I think ruled is probably the right word, by a father who was quite distant from them, who found it difficult to express love. The other major influence on her life, and a parental role, was her aunt, who came to live with them after her mother's death, well, came actually shortly before her mother died. But in her earliest years, Charlotte was surrounded by sickness, by illness, by the spirit of death. And I think you can see that brooding and gloomy atmosphere very forcibly in the first part of Jane Eyre. And also perhaps the search for an identity as an orphan.
Charlotte's early life was a time of some sadness. Her mother died in 1821, and Charlotte and Emily, along with their older sisters Maria and Elizabeth, were sent to Cowbridge Clergy Daughters School. The harsh conditions of this institution are reflected in Charlotte's description of Lowood in Jane Eyre.
Our clothing was insufficient to protect us from the severe cold. We had no boots. The snow got into our shoes and melted there. Our ungloved hands became numbed and covered with chilblains, as were our feet. Then the scanty supply of food was distressing. With the keen appetites of growing children, we had scarcely sufficient to keep alive a delicate invalid.
Their time at Cowbridge was brought to an end by an epidemic of tuberculosis which swept through the school, causing the deaths of Maria and Elizabeth. At home once more, Charlotte and her siblings were cared for by their mother's unmarried sister, Miss Elizabeth Branwell, and their education was overseen by their father. The Reverend Bronte had been born into a poor labouring family in County Down, Ireland, and only by his own determined efforts had he been able to overcome these early disadvantages. He succeeded in graduating from Cambridge University and entering the Church of England. He was therefore acutely aware of the value of education, and he encouraged his children to make full use of the library at Haworth Parsonage.
With little else to amuse them, the Bronte children read widely, and in the mid-1820s they began to take an interest in writing for themselves. They created long romantic sagas set in imaginary kingdoms. Charlotte and Branwell's fantasy world was called Angria, and Emily and Anne's was Gondal. They continued to add to these tales for over 10 years.
Charlotte and all her sisters were voracious readers. They learned to read very early, they had a lot of books at home, and they had access to private libraries in stately homes near where they lived. They couldn't stop reading, and the impact of what they read is very present in Jane Eyre. The writer who is often stated as being the most influential is Lord Byron. And you see the Byronic hero in Rochester, the man of action, the man of passion, the man who carries with him dark secrets, the man who is impulsive, whom you can never really fathom, where there are touches of evil in the background. It is that has the most enduring influence on Jane Eyre.
Charlotte returned briefly to Roe Head as a teacher in 1835, and in 1839 she went to work as a governess, firstly to the White family and subsequently to the Sidgwicks. These experiences were far from enjoyable, and her dislike of teaching is mentioned frequently in her letters and journals of those years. Also during this period, Charlotte received and refused 2 proposals of marriage. It was not until Charlotte and Emily went to study at the Pensionnat Heger in Brussels in 1842 that Charlotte fell hopelessly in love. Unfortunately, it was with Constantin Heger, the school's proprietor, who was happily married, and he did not in any way reciprocate Charlotte's feelings.
Charlotte's first realistic novel, The Professor, was, however, not a success. It was rejected by publishers when it was completed in 1846 and only appeared in print after Charlotte's death. Her second novel, Jane Eyre, which appeared in 1847, was greeted with great enthusiasm by both publishers and the reading public alike. Now established as a successful writer, albeit initially under the vaguely masculine pseudonym of Currer Bell, Charlotte was able to dedicate herself to literature. She published Shirley, a story set amidst Luddite riots and industrial unease, in 1849, and Villette, her most autobiographical work, in 1853.
In 1854, a proposal of marriage came from Arthur Bell Nichols, her father's assistant. Although Charlotte's feelings for the Reverend Nichols lacked the intensity of those she had had for Monsieur Heger, she accepted his proposal. We do not know whether Charlotte would have continued to write great novels after her marriage, or whether she would simply have settled down to her duties as a curate's wife. Charlotte Bronte died of dehydration as a result of pneumonia in 1855, 1 year after her marriage. She was 39 years old and pregnant with her first child. She is buried at the Haworth Parsonage. Her most famous novel, Jane Eyre, clearly reflects many aspects of Charlotte's own life. The hardships endured at Lowood School, Jane's experiences as a governess, her love for a man who is already married. But to what extent is Jane Eyre an autobiographical novel?
Some elements of Jane Eyre are no doubt autobiographical. The terrible conditions at Lowood echo the conditions at Cowan Bridge. The outbreak of typhus fever recalls the fever which killed Maria and Elizabeth Bronte. John Reed's drunken excesses are no doubt based on Branwell's. Even the character of Jane herself, small and plain, sounds a bit like Charlotte, and maybe when Jane says that she wishes she were more aesthetically pleasing, that may well be Charlotte's own sentiment.
The novel begins with the young Jane living in the house of her unpleasant relations, the Reeds. Jane's uncle, Mr. Reed, appears to have been a kind man who undertook to care for his orphan niece as his own. Following his death, however, his wife's resentment of Jane becomes apparent. Jane can do no right, whilst Mrs. Reed's own spoilt, selfish children can do no wrong.
Her aunt sends her to Lowood School on the understanding that Jane will remain there even during vacation times. Lowood is initially a terrible and frightening place. The food is poor, the clothing is inadequate, and the whole establishment is run by the hypocritical Mr. Brocklehurst, who advocates these privations for the pupils, while at the same time providing silk dresses and other luxuries for his wife and daughters. Although Brocklehurst is unpleasant to the other girls in the school, he seems to take a particular dislike to Jane, whom he attempts to brand a liar in front of the other pupils.
Fortunately, Lowood has some compensations. Jane makes friends with a long-suffering and pious older girl, Helen Burns, whom critics believe to be modelled upon Charlotte's own elder sister, Maria. Jane also meets Miss Temple, a kind and compassionate teacher who is able to appreciate Jane for her good qualities.
An epidemic of fever breaks out in the school, after which Brocklehurst loses his power and conditions improve. Jane remains at the school as a teacher until Miss Temple leaves to get married, and Jane begins to wish for greater stimulation than the school can provide. She advertises her services as a governess and is offered a position at Thornfield Hall. Her charge is a French girl called Adele Varens. Adele is spoilt and willful, but she is also sweet and well-meaning. Jane's experiences of governessing and of teaching in general seem to be better than Charlotte Bronte's own.
Jane Eyre is a novel that is about repression, and it's about a free spirit. It's about somebody trying to escape institutions. So the experiences at Lowood School are some of the harshest and angriest experiences of the novel. Jane Eyre objects violently to being regimented. She objects to ways in which men repress women at school, whether they are teachers or whether they are little girls. She objects to the fact that the children all have to have their hair cut in the same way. She objects to the punishment. She objects to the hypocrisy that she sees in the Victorian educational system that masquerades under the guise of being a charitable institution.
Thus far, Jane has only come into contact with her pupil, the servants, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Fairfax. The master of the house, Edward Rochester, is away on business. When Rochester returns, he and Jane are clearly attracted to each other, although Jane is not aware of the depth of her feelings. She believes he is drawn to the haughty Blanche Ingram, whose social status is much nearer his own.
You've been resident in my house for 3 months.
Yes, sir.
Where do you come from?
From Lowood School.
Ah, a charitable institution. How long were you there?
8 years.
8 years? You must be tenacious of life. I would have thought half that time in a place like that would have done up any constitution. No wonder you have rather an otherworldly look about you. I marvelled where you'd got that sort of face. When you came upon me in Hay Lane last night, I thought unaccountably of fairy stories, and was about to demand whether you had bewitched my horses. I'm not sure yet. Where are your parents?
I have none.
Nor ever had, I don't suppose. Do you remember them?
No.
I thought not. Do you have any other sort of kinsfolk? Uncles and aunts?
No, none that I can remember.
Go home?
I have none.
Where do your brothers and sisters live?
I have no brothers and sisters.
Who recommended you to come here?
I advertised, and Mrs. Fairfax answered my advertisement.
Class was very important in the 19th century, both in fact and in fiction. Charlotte was quite familiar with the working classes and the middle classes, though she had more difficulty with the upper classes with whom she wasn't particularly familiar.
Discover the past with exclusive history documentaries from History Hit and uncover the secrets of some of the most famous people and events in history. History Hit gives you access to a growing range of documentaries presented by and featuring historians at the forefront of research and debate. Whether you are looking to find out more about charismatic leaders like Cleopatra or to discover the story behind the Industrial Revolution, History Hit will have something for you. We also aim to bring you the stories and legends that shaped our world through our award-winning podcast network. Sign up now for a free trial, and Absolute History fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code AbsoluteHistory at checkout.
You have lived the life of a nun. No doubt you are well drilled in religious forms. The Brocklehurst, who I understand directs Lowood, is a parson, is he not?
Yes, sir.
And I'm sure you girls worship him, as a convent full of religieuses would worship their director.
Oh, no!
You are very cool, no? How'd a novice not worship our director? That sounds blasphemous.
I disliked Mr. Brocklehurst, and I was not alone in the feeling. He is a harsh man, at once pompous and meddling. He cut off our hair, and for economy's sake bought us bad thread and needles with which we could hardly sew.
And was that the head front of his offending?
He starved us when he had sole superintendence of the provision department, before the committee was appointed. And he bored us with long lectures once a week, and with evening readings from books of his own inditing about sudden deaths and judgments, which made us afraid to go to bed.
Whilst she has been living at Thornfield, Jane has occasionally heard a woman's strange manic laughter coming from the upper reaches of the house. She assumes that a servant with a taste for strong drink is the source. When a fire almost breaks out in Rochester's bedchamber, he himself confirms Jane's suspicion.
However, various other events occur, which gradually reveal to Jane, as well as to the reader, that there is something more peculiar going on in the house than just the drunken excesses of a maid.
Who is there? Who's there? Who is there?
A stranger, Mr. Mason, arrives at the house and is mysteriously wounded during the night. Before Jane has time to discover more, she receives a message that her Aunt Reed is dying and returns to her childhood home. Mrs. Reed shows no remorse at the way she has treated Jane over the years, but she does reveal that Jane has a rich relative, John Eyre, whose existence she had previously kept secret. Mrs. Reed dies, and Jane returns to Thornfield, where Rochester proposes to her. Jane accepts, although we sense that she may have some misgivings about the match. Then, 2 days before her wedding, Jane finds her bridal veil torn to shreds, and on the day of her marriage, a man appears and announces that Rochester already has a wife. Her name is Bertha, and because she is insane, she is kept locked in the attic. Grace Poole is her keeper, although because of her fondness for alcohol, not the most effective of jailers. It is Bertha, not Grace, who has been heard laughing, and who has occasionally escaped to wound Mason, her own brother, and destroy Jane's veil.
Although Rochester insists that he was trapped into his first marriage, Jane is horrified at the deception which has taken place.
Jane Eyre is composed of a series of unforgettable tableaux, really, little cameo scenes. The wedding scene is one of these, because the whole point about a wedding scene is that's normally the moment at which the Victorian novel ends. You only have to think of earlier fictions, things like Jane Austen's novels, for example. They end with marriage. What happens in Jane Eyre is that you actually get what you would expect to be the closure of that novel halfway through the book. And it changes the direction of Jane's life.
Does anyone here present know any just cause or impediment why these two persons here may not lawfully be joined together in holy matrimony?
The marriage cannot go on. I declare the existence of an impediment.
Proceed.
I cannot proceed.
The marriage is quite broken off. I am in a condition to prove my allegation. An insuperable impediment to this marriage exists.
What is the nature of this impediment? Can it not be overcome?
Hardly. I have called it insuperable, and I speak advisedly. It simply consists in the existence of a previous marriage. Mr. Rochester has a wife now living.
Who are you?
My name is Briggs, a solicitor from London.
And you would thrust upon me a wife?
I would remind you of your lady's existence, sir, which the law recognizes if you do not.
Favour me with an account of her. Of her name, her parentage, the place of her abode.
Certain. I affirm and can prove that on the 20th of October, 15 years ago, Edward Fairfax Rochester of Thornfield Hall and of Ferndean Manor in England was married to my sister, Bertha Antoinetta Mason, daughter of Jonas Mason, merchant, and of Antoinetta, his wife, a Creole, in Spanish Town, Jamaica. The record of the marriage can be found in the register of that church. A copy of it is now in my possession. Signed, Richard Mason.
That, if a genuine document, may prove that I have been married, but it does not prove that the woman mentioned therein as my wife is still living.
She was living 3 months ago.
How do you know that?
I have a witness to the fact, whose testimony even you, sir, will scarcely controvert.
Produce him or go to hell.
My hopes were all dead. I looked on my cherished wishes, yesterday so blooming and glowing. They lay stark, chill, livid corpses that could never revive. Mr. Rochester was not to me what he had been, or he was not what I had thought him. I would not ascribe vice to him. I would not say he had betrayed me, but the attribute of stainless truth was gone from his idea.
She leaves Thornfield. Having lost all her money, she finds herself destitute and homeless. Fortunately, she is taken in by a clergyman, the somewhat taciturn St. John Rivers, and his two sisters, Mary and Diana.
The primary way in which religion is portrayed in the novel is through figures who actually profess religious beliefs. Charlotte, however, doesn't give us these three figures as people to emulate, and they all come to rather sticky ends. Helen dies of consumption in Jane's arms. St. John Rivers is dispatched to India to be a missionary, still unmarried, and the implication is that he won't have long to live. And Mr. Brocklehurst has perhaps the most ignominious end for one of his despotic temperament. He's replaced by a committee.
Rivers is able to find Jane work in a girls' school, where she is quite content. It is soon revealed, however, that the Rivers are Jane's cousins, and that the rich uncle mentioned by Mrs. Reed on her deathbed has died, leaving his fortune in equal parts to them and to Jane. The poor orphan is now a woman of means.
St. John Rivers intends to go to India as a missionary. He is romantically involved with a young society woman, Rosalind Oliver. Rosalind, however, does not possess the qualities which Rivers believes are necessary for a missionary's wife. Jane, on the other hand, does. He proposes marriage. Jane, who is aware that he does not love her, refuses.
Jane Eyre is passionate about Rochester. There's the scene where he proposes to her on Midsummer Eve in the garden at Thornfield Hall is, I think, if you read it as a careful reader and are alert to the hidden signals, one of the most passionately erotic scenes in Victorian literature. However, Jane refuses to live with Rochester as his mistress. She refuses to be seduced by him. She goes against her inner feelings of longing. She overcomes desire in order to conform to what she believes is right. And I think there is a sense in which her duty is to be seen at this point not merely as conforming to Christian duty, but actually a sense of her personal integrity. It's a real questioning of the clashing desires that are within Jane.
Some time passes, and Jane begins to think that perhaps she was wrong to refuse River's proposal. She is at the point of agreeing to this loveless marriage when she hears Rochester's voice calling to her. She returns to Thornfield, where she finds the house and Bertha have been destroyed in a fire. Rochester is now blinded and disabled, but he is free to marry.
Give me the water, Mary. What's the matter? That is you, Mary, is it not?
Mary is in the kitchen. Will you have a little more water, sir? I spilt half of what was in the glass.
Who is it? What is it? Oh, who speaks, great God? What delusion has come over me? What sweet madness has seized me?
No delusion. No madness. Your mind, sir, is too strong for delusion. Your health too sound for frenzy.
Who speaks? Is it only a voice? Oh, I cannot see. But I must feel. Or else my heart will stop and my brain will burst, whatever, but be perceptible to the touch, or I cannot go on living. These are her fingers. Her small, fine fingers. If so, there must be more of her. Jane, what is it? This is her shape. This is her size.
And this is her voice. She is all here. Her heart too. God bless you, sir. I am glad to be so near you again.
Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre.
My dear master, I have found you out. I am come back to you.
Truth. In the flesh, my living Jane.
You touch me, sir. You hold me, and fast enough. I am not cold like a corpse, nor vacant like air, am I?
My living darling. These are her limbs. These are features. Oh, I cannot be so blessed after all my misery. Why, it is a dream. Such a dream that I have had at night when I have clasped her to my bosom, as I do now, and felt that she loved me. I trusted that she would never leave me.
Which I never will, sir, from this day.
Does the novel have a happy ending? Charlotte probably wished us to believe that it did, and indeed some modern critics choose to interpret it as a triumph of female determination and fortitude. Others, however, have a different view.
I don't think that Jane Eyre can really be regarded as an early feminist role model. Certainly she's the heroine of her story, and for the most part she's independent. But this is an enforced independence. She doesn't choose to rebel. She's made to by circumstances. When Rochester, for example, decides that he wants to deck her out in fine jewellery, she rejects his gifts. But this isn't out of a feminist principle. She doesn't feel that by taking gifts from a rich man, she'll be sacrificing her identity as a human being or her equality. In 1847, there was no equality between men and women. It was an ideology of separate spheres.
I think that Jane herself is a strong role model, in part because she refuses to conform to other Victorian role models of women. What we find in Jane Eyre is that Jane herself is measured against and rejects a whole range of Victorian stereotypes of femininity.
The words, "Reader, I married him," are perhaps the most famous in the whole novel.